Hey, Rebecca, can you hear me?
Hey, can you hear me okay?
I can hear you. Apparently, it started recording on its own. I'm going to pause the recording.
Yeah, probably.
Muted. And thank you for remembering to hit recording, Joss, because that's the one thing I almost always forget. Um, for today's installment of the WoW Stormwater webinars through NCDEQ, we have a presenter from University of Virginia, and he will be speaking with us on how MS4 permits push development outside of urban areas. Ben Chenault already has his presentation up and he is ready to go. My name is Rebecca Copa and I am from the Erosion Sediment Control Program, and I am substituting for Michelle Evans today. If you have any technical difficulties, please feel free to message myself or Josh Christenke, and we will be happy to help you. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat at any time and we will moderate them to Ben at the end of his presentation. I will drop the link for the PDH surveys into the chat a couple times during the end of the presentation. So if you need PDHs, please remember to fill out the PDH survey. I think that's all. Whenever you're ready to start, Ben.
All right, thank you. I'll go ahead and get started then. So again, my name is Ben Chenault. I'm a PhD student in the economics department at the University of Virginia. And today I'm very excited and happy to share with all of you my research about stormwater regulation and land use. Thank you all again for coming. So to give a little bit of background on myself, I'm an economist who studies environmental policy and land use. The title of this presentation kind of suggests. And so that's a framework from which I'm going to be approaching this research. And I'm really interested to share and hopefully discuss with some of you some of the findings to think about other applications. So to get started, I want to begin just by briefly introducing the kind of economic framework in which I'm thinking about policy in general and stormwater regulations in particular. In particular, what I'm thinking about is how when a new regulation is put in place where some economic agent like a firm or a consumer wants to do something that's now regulated, they have a choice between either complying with that new regulation or doing the activities somewhere else to circumvent that regulation. And when circumventing the regulation is cheaper and easier than complying, then agents have that incentive to relocate. So in many literatures, there are lots of cases of this sort of effect happening. I've highlighted a couple examples from environmental economics literature. So for instance, studies have shown that when new regulations sought to reduce how much people were driving cars to reduce emissions, people just bought more cars. Or that when factories are regulated in their emissions, then firms relocate to other unregulated places to lower their compliance costs. Or on a individual consumer level, when plastic grocery bags are taxed or restricted, people end up buying more thick grocery bags instead. So they substitute one type of plastic for another. When this type of behavior occurs, it can limit the effectiveness of policies over their stated goal. So I'm going to be, so I am studying how land use responds to stormwater regulations with this in mind. So the EPA, as many of you likely know, in part regulates stormwater discharges by the use of municipal separate storm sewer system or MS4 permits, which require that some local governments regulate land development and construction activity within their urbanized areas. The general idea here is that land development creates impervious surface and construction discharges, which can add pollution to stormwater runoff, which can harm the environmental quality of water bodies. Now, if developers see these regulations as particularly costly and costlier than developing somewhere else instead, they have an incentive to relocate to lower their costs. And so what I'm going to do is study land development patterns in and around MS4 localities in 4 states, in Delaware, Maryland, Pennsylvania, and Virginia. So to motivate the idea a bit, there is some evidence that land developers think of stormwater regulation as a new cost to them. Here, these are just a couple of snippets from online newspaper articles of builders thinking it would, increase their burdens or stall housing and infrastructure developments. And so there's some reason to believe that developers are going to see MS4 permits and any new requirements that come along with it for them as a new cost that they're going to have to respond to. And there are a couple of ways that developers may think about responding to any sort of cost shift from a policy, and these policies in particular. I've kind of delineated them into 3 different groups. So first, there is compliance. The idea here would be developers don't really change what they want it to develop or where they want it to go, and instead just add in whatever new BMP requirements are given or whatever local inspectors ask them to do, but they don't fundamentally change where or how much they're developing. Or you could see developers adjusting. So you may see developers disturbing less area to either avoid some like 1 acre developed area threshold, or to reduce the amount of stormwater discharges from their development to lower how much they have to, how much new infrastructure they have to put in to comply. So you may see adjustment on that margin, or you could see this relocation where a developer who's picking where they want to put some infrastructure ends up choosing to go further away from a city center into an unregulated area nearby, rather than into a place where MS4 requirements would be. So this framework leads me to the more empirical research questions that I'm going to try to answer in this research and that we can talk about. The main question is, how are developers responding to MS4 regulation? Or more broadly, how does urban land use respond to regulations that affect the cost of creating it? So, do we see less development in in the regulated areas on the adjustment margin? And do we see any relocation to unregulated areas nearby? I'm also going to try to ask what the relative magnitudes of these effects are, because that'll tell us a bit about how flexible urban land is in responding to new cost shocks. And then finally, I'm going to try to think about what the results mean for the effectiveness of MS4 permits to reduce pollution from stormwater. To give a bit of a preview of results of where we're going to be going here, the answer to the first 2 questions is yes. I'm going to estimate relative decreases in land development in regulated areas and relative increases in land development in unregulated areas surrounding them. Towards the end of the presentation, I'll do a back of the envelope calculation to gauge the relative magnitudes of these effects. And I'm going to estimate that for every 1 acre of impervious surface reduced or averted or prevented in regulated areas, about 1/4 of an acre increase is seen in the surrounding areas nearby. So you could think of this as about 1/4 of the impervious surface that doesn't occur in regulated areas moves right outside beyond the regulatory boundary. And then as for total effectiveness, this isn't necessarily clear just from these findings alone. And so I'll be going through some additional analyses that can help us get a bit more nuance and that I'm interested to share and hear other people's thoughts on, to think about what this might mean for water quality overall. Before moving on, I do want to highlight where this research fits into other related academic research. So the primary thing I think that this research is doing over other similar research in the past is to focus on leakage or moving of urban land development. So a number of those studies, like I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, have studied how things like pollution emissions and consumption choices respond to new regulations. policies affecting land use have usually focused on agricultural land, things like people cutting down forests to build more farmland. The change of urban development as a response to policy hasn't really been studied as much, and we don't have as good of an understanding about how flexible urban land is in location choice within like a broad city area. The second thing that I'm doing is a pretty broad analysis across 4 states of how MS4 permits are affecting impervious surfaces. So some of the past research that studied outcomes associated with MS4 permits and other stormwater regulations has largely used individual case studies from particular localities or implementation strategies from particular localities. So what I'm providing here is a broader, more average effect sort of estimate across a wide range of localities and across a broad area. And then finally, I want to highlight that the findings of my research are consistent with other papers that have suggested that land use regulations can be a driver of behaviors that look like urban sprawl, where land is more tightly regulated in a city, so there's incentive to build outside of the city and induce this sort of sprawling behavior. Past literature hasn't been super clear on the extent to which this occurs, but my research suggests that it is something we're seeing here. Okay, so the roadmap of where this presentation is going to be going. First, I'm going to go through some backgrounds. I'll talk a bit about MS4 permits, and particularly how I'm going to be using them and think about them as a source of variation for land cost or land development cost. And then I'll also walk through a little conceptual framework to think about how to translate these ideas into an empirical analysis. I'll then talk about my data and the research design and empirical strategy that I'm using. And then I'll get into the results. So the main results that I previewed earlier, along with a number of secondary results that hopefully will give us a bit more detailed understanding of how land development is responding. And then I'll do the back of the envelope calculation and a bit of discussion and wrap up. All right, so for some policy background, again, as many of you may know, stormwater discharges are regulated under the Clean Water Act. Large cities were regulated mostly in the 1990s. And then the second phase of MS4 permits came out around 1999, 2000, which affected localities with urbanized area, which is a census designation of a type of urban area. And I'm going to be focusing primarily on phase 2 municipal MS4s for my analysis. And the idea here is that localities with MS4s with drainage points within an urbanized area generally must apply for an MS4 permit. So there is some technical variation in who has to apply all the time, but that's generally how things go. So what do regulated localities have to do? And in particular, how is this going to affect what land developers are thinking about? So localities under an MS4 permit have to demonstrate compliance with 6 minimum control measures. 2 of these requirements in particular require ordinances or some other regulatory measure that's going to affect construction and post-construction runoff. These are going to require that localities, increase inspections or develop strategies to make sure that stormwater is being properly managed on construction sites. And these, I think, are the 2 parts of the 6 minimum control measures that are most likely going to be affecting land developer behavior, and that land developers may see as a source of potential new cost to them. Localities only technically have to implement these within the MS4, their urbanized area. And one thing that I'll be doing later in the analysis is using variation in urban and rural classifications within localities to look at how development is behaving inside and outside the urbanized areas. So next, I'll go through the conceptual framework briefly. So what I want to do here is walk through a bit of a thought experiment about what developer incentives were, like I alluded to at the beginning of the presentation. So you can imagine that you're a land developer trying to make a maximized profit off of developing some plot of land in a city. This city is kind of circular and it has a single city center that people want to be close to. Consumers of developed land like the idea of being close to the city center because that's where they work and where the bustling of activity is. And so you generally see that property values are higher closer to the city centers. And this gives incentive for developers to want to build near these city centers. Now, if they are looking at building around a locality with an MS4 permit, they may see a cost increase to land development within that city center or close to it, which could lower their profits from the cost side. So then this developer has a potential trade-off to make. They can move further away from the city center, lowering how much people are willing to pay for the developed land they're creating. But they can at the same time lower their cost by moving beyond a regulatory boundary. If this incentive exists and developers have flexibility in where they put urban land, then we can expect to see some relocation as developers take advantage of this profit incentive. On the other hand, if developers can't relocate very easily, maybe they have really strong draws to particular parts of cities and they can't just move outside to a rural area, we may see less disturbed area or less new impervious surface, but not an actual shift to a unregulated area. And then if developers aren't able to adjust at all, if they have to kind of take their development size and location as given, we would expect them to either absorb or pass on these costs to consumers, or if they can't do that and become unprofitable, we would see them cease development. These ideas lead me to want to estimate two specific empirical items. So the first is what I'll call the treatment effect. What's happening to impervious surfaces in regulated areas after regulation? That is, what's happening to impervious surfaces in urbanized areas that get an MS4 permit after the permit is given out? And then the spillover effect is what's happening to impervious surfaces right outside of those regulated areas. So are we seeing changes beyond the regulatory boundary as a result? We can take these two estimates and use them to learn about what intuitive story is playing out. So the signs, whether they're positive or negative, will tell us about this. If developers are relocating beyond the regulatory boundary, we should see a negative treatment effect because they're not developing in the urbanized area anymore, and a positive spillover effect because they're developing right outside of it instead. If developers are adjusting but not relocating, then we should see a negative treatment effect because they're lowering the amount of area they're disturbing and impervious surfaces that they're using, but we shouldn't expect to find a spillover effect. And if the costs are too small or developers are unable to have or don't have any flexibility in where and how they're developing, then we shouldn't see any significant changes at all. The relative magnitudes of the two effects are going to tell us a little bit more about just how flexible location choice for land developers is. If the treatment effect is much larger than the spillover effect, then we know there's some flexibility because we are finding a spillover effect, but we're not seeing a lot of relocation. On the other hand, as the spillover effect becomes larger and closer in magnitude to the treatment effect, then we see that development is actually pretty flexible. That is, urban land use is a pretty flexible activity and has a lot of leeway to respond to local policy regulation, which is something useful for policymakers to be aware of. And so we'll compare the relative magnitudes of the effect to kind of see where in this one we're lying. All right, so that's the background done. Now I'll move on to talk about my data and how I'm going to be designing the empirical analysis here. So the data I'm using is primarily remote sensing land use data. The primary data set that I'm using is the Global Impervious Surface Area data set. This came out a couple of years ago, and it's very cool for all land masses on the globe. It reports whether or not a 30-meter cell has any impervious surface. It's yearly. They have data used even going back into the 1970s. But for the purpose of this analysis, I'm focusing on the years 2000 to 2019, and I'll use that yearly data. Perhaps a more familiar data set that I use to supplement is the National Land Cover Database. This one is put out by the USGS, I believe. It tells me about how much impervious surface is on a 30-meter cell. And it also reports other land uses like agriculture or forestry. However, this data set is only available every few years, so it's not a yearly data set. And so I only use it for some supplemental analyses. I prefer the yearly data set for the main analysis. And then I also collect the rollout of MS4 permits to local governments, specifically phase 2 local governments in Delaware, Maryland, Pennsylvania, and Virginia. And the unit of analysis here I'm using is a census block, specifically a year 2000 census block. And I'll call a census block as urbanized if any part of that census block is in an urbanized area, either the 2000 or 2010 census. Now, to estimate the effects of interest, I won't be able to use a simple comparison, say, of average impervious surfaces in cities with MS4 permits and cities without MS4 permits, because this isn't going to account for systematic differences in how the development patterns of those cities have played out. So for example, when MS4 permits are triggered by, say, urbanized area, which itself is triggered by a combined population of 50,000 people, we end up with most regulated localities being more populous or part of more populous urban agglomerations than unregulated ones. And those more populous agglomerations are likely to be more developed and therefore have more impervious surfaces overall. So instead, I'm going to be using a panel structure of the data with a differences econometric design, which will account for both these types of baseline differences and like how big the cities are and common development shocks, things like the recession that affected land development patterns. And I will vary these common development shocks by states and regions to account for things like Virginia having different policy regimes in a given year relative to, say, Maryland or Pennsylvania. The identification assumption here is that without any MS4 permits, so if no regulation had come into effect, impervious surfaces would have changed in regulated and unregulated treated control places at the same rate over time. And I'll show some support for this in a couple of slides of why we might think that this is a reasonable assumption in this case. To be more specific about the empirical design, I'm taking an empirical specification called a two-stage difference in differences from Gardner's 2021 paper. I'm happy to talk about the econometric specification in more detail if there are any questions later. But to give a brief overview of it, the first of the two stages is removing those kind of baseline differences, the census block averages, and the common shocks over time. I use both state level common shocks and watershed basin common shocks, so things like the Chesapeake Bay in Virginia in a given year versus the non-Chesapeake Bay in Virginia in a given year. After those are differenced out, the remaining variation is then used to estimate the treatment effect or the spillover effect. And I estimate those two separately. I build different sample groups to estimate the treatment and spillover effects. The intuition of this comes from a paper by Butts in 2021. For the treatment effect, what I'm going to be doing is comparing localities that received their MS4 permits early. So in my data, that's like 2003, 2004, to those that received them later in like 2013, 2014, 2018. I do this because the eventually treated localities are the most reasonable control group for the earlier treated localities, just because unregulated localities tend to be systematically smaller and not look exactly the same. And again, I'm defining the treated areas being the urbanized area census blocks in localities that have MS4 permits. For the spillover effect, what I'm doing is I'm taking rural census blocks that surround treated areas, and I compare them to the rural census blocks surrounding untreated cities. So you can take a city that has a phase 2 MS4 permit and a city that has no MS4 permit, and I draw a 5-mile circle around them and compare the rural census blocks in those 5-mile circles. This makes sure that I'm comparing the rural periphery of one city to the rural periphery of another city or town, rather than comparing it to rural places kind of really far out from any city. I picked the 5-mile radius based on some local polynomial regressions. I'm happy to talk about why I picked that, but for now, we'll just take the 5-mile as the baseline spillover radius is given. Okay, so that is the research design that I'll be using. So now I want to implement that and talk about the results. So first here, I'm showing you an event study graph for the treatment effect. Here I'm using state by year fixed effects, meaning I'm accounting for differences in, say, Virginia's policy in 2012 versus Pennsylvania's policy in 2012. On the horizontal axis, I'm plotting years relative to when the MS4 permit was given to the locality. So all the coefficients are plotted relative to year 0 when the locality received its MS4 permit. In the pre-treatment period, we don't see any statistically significant difference between regulated and unregulated localities, so early and later regulated localities in this case. This gives us some support for the identification assumption that we had to make earlier, because we don't see any systematic differences in how impervious surfaces were changing in these two different groups up until the point that one of them received an MS4 permit. After that MS4 permit's given out, we see a negative treatment effect, meaning that there's relatively less acres of developed land in these urbanized area census blocks within localities with MS4 permits. The dashed lines here are 95% confidence intervals, so these coefficients are both negative and statistically significant. I then do the same thing for the spillover effect onto rural areas nearby. Once again, we don't see any differences between places that become exposed to localities with MS4 permits and places that don't, up until the point that the MS4 permit is given out. Afterwards, I estimate a positive and statistically significant increase in the amount of developed land in those rural census blocks surrounding MS4 areas compared to rural census blocks surrounding non-MS4 areas. So let's recall the earlier research questions and see where we are. We've answered the first two research questions. So yes, I see relatively less development in regulated areas because the treatment effect is negative. So there's relatively less new development in these places after MS4 permits are given out. And I see a positive spillover effect suggesting that there's increases in development right outside the urbanized area boundary. The relative magnitudes from these effects aren't yet clear, and that's because the estimates here are relative percent changes based on the control group means. And so we can't immediately say, there's a 2% change in one and a 5% change in the other and compare those. We'll have to do a bit more of a calculation, which I'll do towards the end of the presentation. And then, well, what does this mean for effectiveness? There's some quote unquote leakage here, the idea being that some development has seems to have relocated right outside of the urbanized area boundary and may be avoiding some of the compliance parts of the MS4 permit regulations within the locality by doing that, or within the urbanized area by doing that. But it's unclear how problematic for water quality this is actually going to be. And so I'll spend the next couple minutes going through some additional analyses that might give us a bit more nuance to think about what this effect actually means. The first one I want to do is look at how the treatment effect varies by watershed imperviousness. So there's some evidence from ecological literature that suggests that the environmental damages from impervious surfaces to a local water body may be pretty high at relatively low levels of imperviousness. So a number of studies have found these sort of threshold levels where between often like 5 and 20% imperviousness in a watershed, the streams become unable to support different types of life. So I have a little figure here from the city of Gaithersburg in Maryland showing that stream health varies with impervious surfaces. They're healthy at relatively low levels of like below 5% imperviousness. But as you get into stream sheds of 10 to 20% imperviousness, the streams can become severely impaired in their ability to support different types of aquatic life. So this raises a potential concern where the relocation effect might essentially move development from severely impaired watersheds where the marginal change might not have mattered that much to watersheds with less impervious surface where the increase from this relocated development might actually then lead to the impairment of that watershed. And so I'm going to look for evidence about whether or not we should be concerned about this sort of effect happening. So the first thing that I do is just a kind of descriptive analysis of, well, how impervious are the watersheds where these effects are happening? So what you see here are histograms for the sample of urbanized area blocks in MS4 localities, that's the treated blocks, and the rural census blocks within 5 miles of those treated blocks, so the spillover group, plotted by the imperviousness of their Huck 12 watershed in 2001. So on the left-hand side, we have the treated blocks. These are mostly in watersheds below 20% imperviousness, but there are a non-trivial amount that are in those kind of severely impaired watersheds that are above 20% impervious. On the right-hand side, we see that for the spillover group, virtually all of the sample is in watersheds below 20% imperviousness, and the vast majority are in watersheds below 10% imperviousness. Okay, so these are just kind of repeating what I just said. And so the question then is how much of the treatment effect is happening in the low versus high imperviousness watersheds? That is, how much of the treatment effect of reducing new impervious surfaces is happening over here versus over here? Because all the spillover effect is happening here kind of by design. So the way I'm going to answer this here is by splitting my treated sample into blocks that are in the high imperviousness or above 20% impervious watersheds and those below 20% impervious. I've picked 20% just based on my read of the ecological literature for where watersheds really become severely impaired. But if anyone has ideas about different ways to split this, I'd be very interested to hear. What I plot here for the results are difference in difference estimates of that treatment effect. So in blue, we have the effect that I showed earlier, just summarized as an average across all post-treatment use. So this is for all units at negative and statistically significant treatment effect. In red here, I have the blocks that are in at-risk or watersheds below 20% imperviousness. And again, we see a negative and statistically significant effect. And then in green, I have the blocks in severely impaired watersheds. So those that are more than 20% impervious in 2001. And here we have a positive, less statistically significant, a bit noisier estimate, but it's still positive and statistically significant. So this tells us that there's relatively less impervious surface in watersheds with low baseline imperviousness, and maybe an increase in the high baseline areas. This suggests that the treatment effect reductions are happening in these possibly more marginal watersheds with lower imperviousness rather than the severely impaired ones. My read on this, but I'm open to hearing other ideas, is that it's kind of a good sign that the reductions in impervious surface in developed areas seem to be occurring in watersheds where they may be most useful relative to watersheds where they may be less useful. The mechanism for this isn't obvious, and I'm not really sure what might be driving this thing. This could be some prioritizing from local policymakers trying to target more at-risk watersheds, or it might be that those highly developed baseline areas just aren't going to have the cost incentive that will drive down development just because of MS4 permits. Okay, so that is the first of the secondary analyses. Next, I want to move on to looking at spillover effects by distance. So earlier, I was taking an average spillover effect across all rural census blocks 5 miles, less than 5 miles from an urbanized area boundary. But here I want to ask, how does the effect size change as you move further and further away from that urbanized area boundary? The idea here is that if the distance to city center is really the main driver of where developers are choosing to locate, then we should see that the effects are strongest close to the boundary. Developers will be looking to just move past the regulatory boundary, not to relocate very far away. And this may be helpful for thinking about policies that could reduce spillovers or to design policies regulating land development more generally. The way I'm going to empirically do this is compare 1 mile rings around the treated cities to the one mile rings around untreated cities. That is, compare rural census blocks that are within 1 mile of the boundary to rural census blocks within 1 mile of an unregulated boundary, and then 1 to 2 miles and 2 to 3 miles and so on in mutually exclusive rings. I have all of these effects plotted here in this event study. It's a little crowded, so we'll walk through it briefly. Again, I don't see any significant differences in the pre-treatment period, showing that these areas were developing at the same rate up until they had a nearby locality get an MS4 permit. In blue here at the top, we have the effect for 1 mile. This is the strongest and largest positive spillover effect. And they decrease until 5 miles down here in teal. It's a little bit clearer if we look at the table for the average effects. Within 1 mile, we have about a 5% increase in developed area. And this goes down to about a 3% increase when you get to 4 to 5 miles away. And it decreases along the way. So the effects seem to be decaying with distance from the urbanized area boundary, and that's consistent with distance to the city center being a major driver of where local governments are, where developers are choosing to develop land. Another thing to point out here is that because I'm estimating large effects right on the border, where some of these rural census blocks are actually in the same locality as the regulated urbanized area, it's suggesting that these rural blocks in regulated localities aren't being treated as in the same way as the urbanized area in terms of the cost structure. Or how developers are seeing the cost structure of developing there. Okay, so that's for distance. I next want to look at other land uses. The idea here being that, well, if developed land is increasing in these rural census blocks, what's decreasing? Prior to any phase 2 MS4 permits going out, the land use splits were pretty even between developed land, forested land, and agricultural land, about a third for each. Other land covers like wetlands made up very small percents. Knowing what land is converting from when it becomes developed is important for thinking about net water quality effects. We might think that, say, converting forested land to urban land may worsen water quality nearby, but converting agricultural land to urban land isn't necessarily as clear cut of an issue. You might think, for instance, that high fertilizer agriculture has a lot of nutrient runoff potentially, and how that compares to the runoff from an unregulated urban development isn't immediately obvious to me. And so what I do here is I use the NLCD, the National Land Cover Database, that will tell me about agricultural and forested land use in these areas to look at how they're changing after they become exposed to spillovers. So on the left-hand side here, I have the event study for agricultural land. Again, we don't see any difference in the pre-treatment period. And in the post-treatment period, I see negative and statistically significant differences, suggesting that rural census blocks near these regulated urbanized areas had less agricultural land after they became exposed to the MS4 permit compared with rural areas that weren't exposed. The evidence for forested land is a little bit more mixed. Again, there's not much going on in the pre-treatment period, but there's a little bit more noise. And in the post-treatment period, there's some different effects. Some years look negative, some years look positive. I will note that because the NLCD isn't a yearly data set, I don't observe every single census block in year T+5, for instance. So we shouldn't necessarily think of this as implying that forested land was oscillating around 0 after these blocks had a MS4 locality nearby, but rather some of them experienced relative increases in forested land and some experienced relative decreases. So to briefly discuss, again, we see less agricultural land in these spillover areas, more mixed evidence on the forested land, and the water quality implications of this aren't necessarily clear. I think they'll be important to consider because the relative contributions of agriculture and urban land to nutrient loading and water pollution isn't immediately obvious to me, but I'd be interested to hear other people's thoughts about them. And then finally, I want to look at spillover effects to urban clusters. So all the spillover analysis so far has looked at rural areas, not to other urban areas. Rural census blocks make up the vast majority of land areas surrounding regulated urbanized areas, but some localities with MS4 permits do have urban clusters in their jurisdictions. And these aren't necessarily covered by the MS4 permits, so they can be depending on state and regulated preferences. But it's not immediately obvious how development is going to respond there systematically. If they're included in a general individual permit, then they will be regulated like the urbanized areas are. Developers may, on the other hand, want to relocate to urban clusters nearby if they want to be in an urban setting, but don't want to deal with changes from MS4 permits. On the other hand, developers may try to avoid urban parts of regulated localities altogether if they're worried about changes to the urbanized area definition later. And so it's not entirely clear what these places are going to look like, if they're going to look more like the urbanized areas, or if they're going to look more like the rural areas nearby. So what I'm going to do is compare the urban clusters in localities with MS4 permits to urban areas, mostly other urban clusters, in distant unregulated localities. Here I've plotted this. I use all the different time fixed effects just to show that the effects are pretty consistent. Once again, we don't see any significant differences in the pre-period, and afterwards I estimate a negative effect. So this suggests that there is less development in these urban clusters relative to urban areas in localities without MS4 permits. It suggests that urban clusters are not recipients of development that's relocating out of urbanized areas. If anything, they are responding more like the urbanized areas. And the mechanism for this, again, isn't particularly clear. This may be that on average, urban clusters tend to be included in policies implemented by localities. It could be that developers are avoiding them altogether. I'd be interested to hear thoughts, but I'm not exactly sure where this is coming from. Okay, now I want to spend the last couple minutes wrapping up. So as one of the original research questions is how big are the relative magnitudes of the treatment and spillover effect? So I'm going to do a back of the envelope calculation to try to convert those relative changes into actual amounts of impervious surface. So the estimates that I get are percent changes of developed land. So I can use those to calculate the average increase or decrease in developed land in regulated or unregulated census blocks. For the spillover effect, I calculate it within each 1 mile ring just to be a bit more precise. And then I scale those calculations based on how impervious on average developed area is. Recall that the global impervious surface area data set just tells me if a 30-meter cell is developed, not how impervious it is. So doing this, I estimate 6,400 acres of impervious surfaces prevented across roughly 800 local governments in the 4 states. Again, this is most likely prevented development that didn't happen or was adjusted in some way, not like people ripping up their driveways. That may have happened, but it's unlikely that that's the primary driver. And then across the rural spillover area, I estimate about 1,500 acres of impervious surface induced. And of interest is that about half of all of this induced impervious surface occurs within 1 mile of the regulatory boundary. So this gives us a total of 24%. So about 24% of the impervious surface reduced is kind of compensated with increases right outside. So to wrap up, I find evidence broadly consistent with land developers responding to cost changes from MS4 permits, reducing the amount of new developed area in urbanized areas, and some of them relocating outside of it to rural areas nearby. About half of that relocation, it seems to occur within 1 mile of the regulatory boundary. Some quick caveats. I don't include urban areas in this calculation. It's just urbanized area to rural areas nearby, because it's not immediately clear how to include those places. And then these effects are relative effects, not accounting for general trends. So it doesn't mean that there was 6,400 acres less impervious surface in aggregate, just that relative to the unregulated or not yet regulated places, there was that much less. And then finally, I want to wrap up with a few thoughts for thinking about water quality, which might be interesting to discuss. So we do see that more impervious surface is reduced and relocated. So that should mean less stormwater runoff generated. It looks like the treatment effects are concentrated in low imperviousness watersheds that may be more at risk. Spillover land development looks like it's crowding out agricultural land, and that's not immediately clear to me what that's going to mean for those streams. And then finally, construction control is only one part of MS4 policy. There are lots of other things that occur through stormwater management programs in local governments that may be affecting water quality. And so, kind of scale what this means based on how important that component is to water quality improvements. So with that, I finished the material I've prepared. Very interested to have discussions and questions. Thank you again for your time. If I don't have time to address something or you think of something later, please feel free to reach out to me with my email address here. I'd be really
Anyone else
interested.
has questions, please feel free to put them in there. The first question is from Francine. It's, do you anticipate publishing your findings in professional publications, and if so, when? And she comments that your analysis is thorough and your findings compelling for local governments.
Oh, thank you. Yes, so I do hope to publish this in an academic journal. It's not clear yet when it's going to happen. So I am this semester, so because I'm still a grad student, this semester I'm presenting at conferences. Next semester I will be on the job hunt. And so probably I'll begin submission processes sometime next year. Until then, it's going to be a working paper.
Thank you, Ben.
Yep.
Francine asks, any thoughts on which conferences?
Which thoughts on what, I'm sorry?
On which conferences?
Oh, so I will be going to mostly economics conferences. I'll be at the Eastern Economics Association in February, and I'm hoping to be in the conference for the Association of Environmental and Resource Economists in May.
Suzanne comments, Ben, excellent talk and work. And her question is, how do you account for policies by state and
I'm sorry, Rebecca, you cut out.
Okay. The question is, how do you account for policies by state and local governments for acquiring parkland in or near urban areas?
It's a good question. So I'm not explicitly accounting for that, but that should be, so that could be showing up in a couple of places. So in, if this is kind of a general thing that local governments are doing, then we should see this coming out actually in the treatment or spillover effects. So like if local governments are explicitly targeting to acquire more like open, undeveloped land in regulated areas, they should be, we should see that the treatment effect is actually larger because more development is going to be kind of reduced by force since there's less land left to develop. If it's happening in the spillover areas, it's going to be relatively reducing that. If this is more of an idiosyncratic thing by local governments, it's going to end up being baseline differences that are being differenced out. So if one particular locality really likes doing this, or it's a, you know, state program in Pennsylvania for a couple of years, that'll probably get differenced out in the first stage and won't be part of the remaining variation that's being used to estimate. If you know more about specific policies targeting that, though, I'd be very interested to hear about them.
Thank you. The next question is, and I'm sorry if I'm cutting out, what are your thoughts about local governments being able to apply MS4 requirements within their extraterritorial jurisdiction instead of just within their city or town limits?
I'm not super familiar with that term. Are you referring to like where local governments can say apply to like things within like other stream sheds that intersect their jurisdiction?
I believe she means, so say if the county, being able to apply it within the entire county rather than within the specific city or town within that county.
Got you. Yeah, so I think I feel like that is pretty, that seems like an intuitively promising idea for me. So this effect that about half of all the development that's relocating is happening within 1 mile of the urbanized area boundary suggests to me that if the regulatory boundary was wider than the urbanized area, there would be fewer and fewer developers who still had the incentive to push out. This sort of effect is coming from unequal policy landscapes. And so the extent to which policy landscapes are kind of smoothed and made equal across space, we should actually be reducing the spillover effects and having less distorted behavior.
Thank you. The next question is from Alicia. It is, did you consider urban development boundaries for water and sewer services which may not align with the MS4 area in influencing development location decisions?
No, I didn't include other boundaries, like other zoning boundaries or other water and sewer service boundaries in this analysis. I just picked the urbanized area as kind of a baseline. If you know of ways to find those sorts of maps to look more explicitly at them, I'd be really interested in including that. My hope is that the urbanized area is a good approximation for what's happening with the MS4 areas. But it's not immediately obvious to me what other sorts of zoning is going to do or how that's going to interplay with these sorts of effects. But I would be interested to talk more about how that might come into play.
Perfect. And I will make sure to drop your email in the chat. So if anyone wants to reach out to discuss that further, then it will be there for them to grab.
Awesome.
DJ, I don't know the answer to that question. I don't know if there's anyone else from DEQ online today that can answer DJ's question in the chat. The question is, will NCDEQ step up efforts to require MS4 requirements in areas outside regulated areas? So DJ, you might need to reach out to our MS4 coordinator, Isaiah Reed. And I think that is all the questions that I see in the chat. I am gonna.
Oh, I do see one from.
I saw one just pop in too.
Yeah, from Akin.
I see one from Emily. Oh no, I see Akin too. You can address that one.
Yes. So did your research account for spatial changes in regulatory or urban area boundaries over time? Kind of. So what I do is I take year 2000 census blocks, and then I overlay them with urbanized area in 2000 and urbanized area in 2010. And so if the year 2000 census block is part of an urbanized area in either of those years, I count it as regulated. So this is kind of conservative for the spillover effect and generous for the treatment effect. So the idea is like if a block could ever have been part of a treated area, I count it as treated. Just so that the geographic sample areas stay consistent throughout.
Perfect. And if you see that last one from Emily, or do you want me to read it out to you?
I see it. Are you aware of any programs by local governments to offset spillovers observed in your research? It would be interesting to compare the spillover municipality with such a program to other findings to determine efficacy. So I'm not, I've talked with a couple of MS4 operators in Virginia and West Virginia. I know some were looking for guidance to be able to like controlled development in any stream shed nearby them to hopefully mitigate that. And others who were thinking about, this may have been wastewater. I do know some governments were thinking about doing things like tradable permits for water pollution, and hoping to trade only with upstream localities so that the benefits would occur upstream to them. I'm not aware of any other programs, but if anyone else here is, that would be really interesting to hear how local governments are trying to manage this. I'll confess that this is actually my first time presenting this to people, this stage of the research, presenting to people who work in stormwater management for local governments. So I'd be really interested to hear any other thoughts there.
Perfect. And thank you so much again for joining us today, Ben. It seems like this is a good audience for this topic, and you may want to consider presenting at future stormwater conferences.
Yeah, that sounds great. Thank you again for your time and for your attention. I really enjoyed this conversation. I do see that my email is in the chat, so if you have any other thoughts or anything, please feel free to reach out. I'd love to discuss more.
Perfect. And our next WoW webinar is on February 15th, so remember to join us again next time. Thank you, everyone, and we'll be closing out the webinar. Don't forget to click the PDH link before you leave.